Well, after last night's show and the way that we started it, I left and got really inspired. If you didn't watch last night's show, I found my favorite children's book yesterday. That is Shel Silverstein, and it prompted me to end the show last night and write a poem for my dear co-host. And so, Steve, this is for you. I saw you light up when I read that poem last night.
Yeah, I like
so
poetry.
I was like,
I've read you some of my poetry.
well,
Yeah.
I think you'll really like this. There once was a wizard named Steve who used to hide many things up his sleeve. He once took a chance and hit a rat up his pants. Now he sounds like his wife Genevieve.
The only one I know similar is how about
why
this
is there
one?
no clapping, Dave? I thought we had the clap track ready.
There once was a man from Nantucket that and I can't finish that one.
I worked really
That's
hard
the
on
only one I
that. I can't believe that you didn't give me any more than that. I'm
That
kind
was
of
good.
offended.
No, that was really good.
Stop.
I'm processing.
So 2 days ago on the Smoking Gun with Katie, we had Ethan joining us. Welcome back. I didn't know it would be this quickly, but nonetheless, it's good to have you back.
Yeah, not a problem.
And Ryan, why don't you take a second? I'll introduce you both here in just a second officially, but why don't you take a second, Ryan, and let everybody know how we ended up where we are here so quickly based on the show the other day.
So I watched the show with Ethan the other day, and I noticed that I went to comment when I heard that he was religious, but everything else that he was saying I could totally agree with and find logical, and I realized that I wasn't the first, I wasn't the second, I wasn't the third person to try to comment that.
Yeah.
So I sent him a message and was like, hey, you should talk to atheists. And he agreed to that. So then I posted in the comment section that I was going to have that conversation. And then Kyle, I think, offered for us to have it here instead, which is obviously much better than anything I can do on my own. So and we decided to have the same conversation here.
Now you'll never know. If you'd have took the chance, you could be the next Sally Jesse Raphael or Ricky Lake.
Oh,
you probably have no idea who those two people
so
are.
80s.
Mr. Chance,
man. So 80s, man. You were like
Maury?
3 when that was on, Kyle.
Well, think about this though. Maury was on when Ricky Lake was on, because they I believe they used to follow each other. Maury is still on. Maury is still telling people that they are not the father.
They're not
Maury George.
No, they're not reruns. It's so funny because if you go back and you look at Maury, like back in those days, he was doing shows kind of like Dr. Phil would do. You know, these very serious, people are in trouble, sort of shows. I feel like maybe this is the art that this show will take, because we sort of started out that way, but as the flat Earth movement sort of gained traction and people really responded to the flat Earth, we completely there for a little bit sold out and went to flat Earth. And that's exactly what Maury did. He saw that the ratings skyrocketed when he had the lie detector test, and he was just like, fuck it, we're just doing lie detector tests all day long. So
do you remember Wally George?
No.
His daughter was Rebecca De Mornay. He was the mouth from okay. Go back and try to find some Wally George. I mean, he was the precursor to Maury Povich and all those guys. He was the original shock host. And by the way, Katie's been wanting to say hi to you, Ethan, from the live chat there. So she said, for me to tell you hi.
Hey, very it's cool. All good. Hello. Good to be back. I'll say hello back to Katie. But yeah, thanks.
And don't forget Geraldo Rivera, Steve.
Yeah,
Geraldo Rivera. Yeah, but he actually got knocked around. I mean, he got a few black eyes. I think he broke his nose.
I have to admit, going into this this discussion, you know, you always have sort of, you know, who you want to see, like, you know, who you think's going to do well, who you want to see do well, and I like both of these guys. It's really hard It was really hard for me. I was very conflicted coming into this, and right before we went live, I got unconflicted because Ethan, I was pulling for you, man, but I can't forgive the Captain Crunch thing. I really can't.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
That's a deal breaker.
So they're in the back of the room. I can't see him.
Well, I'll let it slide then.
All right.
Okay. So if you didn't join us two afternoons ago, we had Ethan Lindenberger join us, and he has gained very wide notoriety for defying his mother's wishes and choosing to get vaccinated. It gained national media attention and congressional. He sat in a congressional hearing. He is in the midst of all of this, and it's sort of it can be a vicious world to be in the middle of. Like, I don't envy you in your pursuit to do this, but nonetheless, good on you. So if you haven't seen that interview, make sure that after this is over, you go back and watch that, because it was fantastic. He is definitely doing some really cool things and getting to see a lot of really cool people and be a part of change. So that's definitely something cool. So let's take a second and let you guys say a few words about who you are and why you do what you do. Ryan, we'll start with you. Who exactly are you, Ryan Price?
Yeah, who even is this guy?
I am a nobody, essentially. I'm a science advocate. I'm a musician and a dog walker by trade. So what I really like doing is thinking, I suppose. And I was religious for a while, and I have, I would say, grown out of that. But I happen to know Ethan through his brother Isaac, who I've debated a few times. We're like mutual enemies on subjects. We get along really well, but we don't agree on essentially anything.
Like and
yeah. And so then I offered to debate Ethan, or not really debate Ethan, but just like kind of have conversations with him about atheism, because I feel like he's logical on every other subject. And so because I already know his brother, that's pretty much where I come from.
Today on the young and the vaccinated.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm feeling good.
They won't right. Either. Okay. Ethan. Who is
so
Ethan Linden?
You kind of already introduced me pretty well. I mean, the only reason that Ryan even reached out and we're here again is because, passingly at the end of the show we did recently, it was just like, hey, what do you want to do after high school? And I said, well, I'm hoping to go into ministry. And everyone's kind of like, what? That's really dumb. And I mean, I totally get that. I totally understand. And when Ryan even reached out, he was like, I think you should listen to some more atheistic, skeptical perspectives. And I was like, yeah, totally. And so one of the things that I've made sure to be aware of is I'm not trying to avoid conversations, at least with people that are logical. Because I know a lot of the anti-vax community, a lot of them are show ponies for misinformation and selling things to people that are totally bogus. And so this is a conversation that I'm totally willing to have because it's kind of very different in that sense. So I was totally willing to jump on and kind of go through that with Ryan and you guys.
Wow, it's so different having somebody who is a Christian as yourself speak the way that you do. It's not what we are used to here. Yeah. We're used to get how would you describe it, Steve? It's
people should be willing to put their beliefs and their arguments up for consideration and review. I mean, and that applies to everybody, atheists as well, and Christians. And we don't usually find that. Usually the people we find, they're so hardcore in their ideological beliefs that they're not willing to even entertain arguments against. And so, no, I find it to be refreshing.
Absolutely. All right. So what we're going to do now is we'll turn it over to Ryan. Steve and I will be here to sort of make sure that we keep the conversation on track and don't go too far off the rails. Other than that, we don't want to gang up on anybody or anything like that. So we're going to let you two have a conversation. At the end, if we have anything that we want to add or ask, we'll do that, and then we'll do audience questions. But Ryan? You can ask,
Awesome.
start whenever you want to.
So I guess the most important thing would be why do you believe in, what kind of God do you believe in? Like, what do you think God explains to you? What does God mean to you?
Yeah. So outlining kind of what I believe is a little difficult because when you just say like Christian, you have a label with a lot of associations because you have a lot of different denominations, you have different belief systems, ideas. And so for me, like I would say that I'm not like a fundamentalist, which is where you believe like in a lot of very literal interpretations and that everything is actually 100% accurate. So I'm not someone that will go like, yes, Noah took 2 of every animal and put them on a boat. That like for me, like there is a little bit of logical like inconsistency to like believe that. And so one of the things that I've developed over the past few years, because I've tried to engage with as many like critical thinkers and not judge by just like their faith. Someone like Jordan Peterson has come along and really like convinced me that some of these things can be metaphorical, can be stories, folklore, and still have some meaning. It doesn't mean it needs to be literal, and you can still uphold that and look at it and get something out of it. So for like a lot of the Old Testament and a lot of the Bible, even to a majority, I do look at it as more like metaphorical. A lot of it was folklore, a lot of it is cultural as well, and part of it too, like I would explain very quickly, not to elaborate and like tangent go on, but like so for like, a lot of Christians, if you were to say like, okay, you know, the Old Testament says like you can stone people for like committing adultery, they would say that's a cultural thing of the time, but then they wouldn't say that Noah's Ark is a cultural story, right? That's folklore. And so I try and balance that as much as I can and see, you know, what I believe. And so really like the most undermining thing I do believe completely is that Jesus was a real individual that was buried, died, and resurrected, and that God, as Yahweh of the Old Testament of the Jewish people, was like the Father. That kind of classic Christian thinking. But a lot of like the way that's written and been interpreted since then, I'm kind of a little more lenient and understanding of, and I still try and engage with that and engage in conversation with that. So
Okay.
I hope that kind of clarifies.
I can at least work with that.
So,
yeah. So you essentially think that the Bible is written by the creator of the universe, correct?
Okay, so no. So there's this idea in fundamentalist thinking where the Bible is divine word and inspired, or it was written directly by God. So you're seeing like on a lot of religions, like the Mormon belief system, that an actual tablet of writing completely finished was given to man by an angel or God or by a deity. And a lot of the Bible and Christian believing people say that the Bible was inspired and that God worked through them to give them the inspiration and the stories and keep it factual, which leads to a lot of like inconsistencies. Because then if you go, well, what if this wasn't true? They'd go, no, because God did it. And you're like, why? I'm like, because it's God. And so I'm a little more of like contemporary in that sense of like, yes, the Bible has gone through a lot of changes, but there are also some historical accounts you can look at for people like Jesus who was a real person on a historical basis. And then that comes down to personal belief. So,
okay.
I mean, for the Bible itself to say like, yes, 100% God wrote it is a little like inaccurate in my mind and also not really true.
So why do you put stock in the Bible at all then? Like the stories from the Bible, essentially.
Well, you could look at someone like Jordan Peterson and also other scholars who aren't even Christians that look at the Bible and say like, yeah, like there's some stuff we can get out of this. Not metaphorical. You can look at meanings in terms of like the stories themselves and not even just like literally presenting them and saying this actually happened.
Do you feel like there isn't anybody like Jordan Peterson for other religions?
There are. No, totally. And that's the thing that I try and engage with. So I try and speak to other religious people as well. And that's the thing also like with kind of like that Bible thumping Christian mentality of like, if you don't believe this, you're going to hell. Everyone believes this. Like that kind of stuff is really frustrating because there's so much more out there. And pursuing like a Christian theology is something that I've also been grown up in. And I'm trying to engage with the best I can. But I've seen that there's at least some historical accounts. And I kind of buy into the philosophy as well behind, Jesus himself. And that's kind of where I fall into it. And that's why I kind of put stock into it. But I'm sparingly. I'm not going like, yes, all of this is 100,000% infallible.
So fair enough. If it was, what would it change for you if you were to realize that it wasn't the case? Like what do you predict would be different in your mind?
Of what wasn't the case? What do you mean?
Like if you didn't believe in your version of Christianity, what would be left? Are you intimidated by believing in just the natural world?
No, I mean, not at all. Because you're talking about how a lot of people, their morality isn't changed by believing in the natural world. Their actions aren't hindered. Their happiness isn't diminished. And a lot of people can live very good and fulfilling lives, without a Christian doctrine. And so like a lot of Christians hold this idea, like if you don't believe in the Bible, you can't be moral, or you can't be happy, or you can't be fulfilled, which doesn't make a lot of sense, because it's not like an end all be all, right? So for me, if like my belief was challenged and it was changed or modified, it would just be a new system of belief that for me I would adopt to, and I would change accordingly with the information presented to me. And I don't think that would change everything about like my lifestyle.
Right. Yeah, that's essentially what I mean is, so if nothing would change if you stopped believing in God other than that you don't believe in God, then what do you believe in God for? Because to me, when I believed in God, it was because I thought it explained where the universe came from, or maybe where consciousness came from, or something. I thought it explained something, which is why it was important. You don't. Well, I'm not picking up on what you think it explains.
So when you're talking about like what God explains, a lot of the idea that's presented is like, okay, God was used as a supernatural reasoning for natural events. And
I mean,
as much as I understand,
to you.
Yeah. Well, so for me, like the reason that God has evolved, at least for both the culture and for me specifically, does come from a place of like philosophy, from a place of personal security. And for me, and I say this as myself, it could be for someone else, it could be different. I just find a lot of contentment and community, and also like the philosophy of God and Jesus of unconditional love, of forgiveness, is something that I find security in and almost like a sense of fulfillment in. And that's because I've invested into it, right? And so I don't know what would happen if I invested in something else. But for me, my faith in what I've seen is decently logical, and having some historical background is enough for me to invest into, and it's been fulfilling, at least for me. And I wouldn't say like you have to do that in order to like live a life that's at all like above zero, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, but if you're going to commit your life to the ministry, you think this is a little bit more true than kind of true, or maybe true.
Well, no, it's not even just kind of true, because if you're talking about ministry, right? Ministry isn't just like meant to throw Bibles at people and say, believe this or you're going to hell, which I would never do. If I went into ministry, I would work alongside a church that was a community center that was also trying to teach people about not just like literal events and say like, we're going to look at Luke 10 and talk about a random dude who doesn't really matter. Like we would talk about what my church does. They talk about the meaning behind things, the applicability to our lives. And that can go for anyone. People can walk into my church, not believe a single thing, and leave with something, right? And even if they don't agree with the actual like historical account, or they don't believe with the actual literal interpretation, they can still walk away. And many people I've spoken to do. They do believe that like those things aren't literal, but they still walk away with something interpretive, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. What do you personally see as the difference between that and people who go to like a Star Wars book club and can identify the good guys from the bad guys in the books?
Well, you're talking about which is a fictional account by 100%, no doubt, and what I believe to have some historical account. So I feel like it's a little different. And when you're talking about like someone going into a club and getting fulfillment out of that, yeah, like they might have the same outcome in terms of like their friendship, their community. But for a church specifically, there is an offering of counseling. There's an offering of not just like a community, but like community outreach and help.
There's a Jedi religion.
I mean, like, you get what I mean. And this is the thing too, like, I'm not saying here, like, I'm not going and saying like Christianity is like 100,000% like you have to believe this or going to hell. Like that's something that I feel like is used to kind of cut off people and almost like guilt trip people into believing and forcefully trying to present a belief system. But like religion by and large is something that I have invested into, right? And Christianity specifically, both because of my upbringing and because of what I've seen and encountered. So if someone came with an Islamic belief, or they came to me with a Jewish belief, and I looked at that, analyzed it, compared it, and there was a strong enough case, I'd have to seriously consider that. And that mindset of being open and trying my best to engage with that is something that I hold like above anything else.
All right. Maybe a different tangent with this. I kind of understand where you're coming from.
Okay.
What exactly, you have doubts probably about your beliefs, right? Do you feel like atheists have any points, or agnostics or whoever have any points that sort of like stand out to you? Like is there any, do you have any pause in your belief, or is this just like instilled in you and it just means so much?
No, so that's a great question, actually. There are some things that I kind of grew up believing where I was like, that's kind of baloney after I looked into it, or I saw an argument being presented. And so I think I mentioned this a little bit to you when we were like talking a little bit outside of this discussion. One of the biggest things was like, you cannot be moral outside of religion, which that like, if religion didn't exist, society would fall apart, and you'd have, if you were an atheist, like you'd live by your own code and kill, rape, and steal like accordingly. Like that's kind of the idea presented within a church sometimes, because I've seen very fundamentalist churches where that's kind of done, right? Which I don't agree with. And the reason I don't agree with it is because I engage with people like Nietzsche, who like really challenged the church's role in an individual life, and how if that was gone, you'd still be able to live a life that is moral, just on a different interpretation of that. And so
can you give me an example of something that you have a current issue with in your faith?
Yeah. So for a current issue, I mean, there's not a lot I've seen presented in terms of like 100,000% like this is really challenging. There's some stuff that I've struggled with in terms of like one of the things that I've always kind of balanced between is like abortion, because that's something that a lot of people will just use as like a religious argument and go, because the Bible says so, it's wrong. But there's also some really good arguments to be made that, even if you made it illegal, people would still get them and it'd be more dangerous at that point. And so those are things I take pause on, and I'm like, man, maybe the religious aspect of this is kind of lost. And so I try and not make like a judgment on stuff like that that's a little more vague. And I find like questioning, and I find atheist arguments a little more convincing because they're not like hinging on a book, and they're more on a logical, like fact-based statistical approach. So stuff like that, right, especially more political stuff, I find hard.
So what's hard for me right now is that I essentially resonate with everything you're saying, but somehow it doesn't get me to the conclusion that there's a supernatural realm, or that perhaps when I stopped believing in Jesus, that was for dumb reasons, and that like I get that there's history to the Bible and everything like that.
Right.
But I don't understand where, like, everything you're saying is logical, but it doesn't lead to the conclusion that therefore I should believe this is true.
Right. So we're talking more about like biblical reasonings and not as much like philosophical. And so that's kind of where I think you might be having some judgments.
Potentially. So when I stopped believing in God, I started believing in like pantheism for a small period of time because I didn't really want to say that I didn't believe in God. So just the universe was God.
Right.
And I asked myself the question, like, what is the difference between believing in God and wanting to believe in God? And ultimately, that's why I stopped calling myself a pantheist, because what's the point? If you believe in the universe, you believe in the universe. It's just silly to bother calling it something else.
Right.
So I feel like I haven't really identified what it is you're calling. Like, you're saying Yahweh of the Old Testament, but nothing you're saying represents that, and you don't think that, like, the characteristics of Yahweh of the Old Testament. I've read the Old Testament. I went to Catholic school too.
Yeah.
So I don't think that there's I don't think Yahweh of the Old Testament behaves in the way that you are rationalizing. I don't know how to say that more politely.
So yeah, I get what you're saying. And you don't need to like worry, like, I'm not offended by that. Like, oh my God, how dare you?
So then why believe in it though? Why believe that's the creator of the universe?
Well, so you're talking about how the Jewish faith, which is where Jesus kind of where he was finding belief in, the Jewish faith was interpreted, written down, and passed on mainly through oral tradition that developed into the Old Testament. And you're also seeing how the New Testament, which came along, I think it was like between 20, 30, 40 years after Jesus was, some of the New Testament was written, and by a majority of it by Paul. The accounts of Jesus, we have very like sound history in. So we're talking about how we have historians and Romans that accounted that Jesus was a real person, that he was crucified, that he deserved it, and that shows it wasn't like tainted with. And then at that point, you can use the information being compiled that Jesus was saying he was God, and that he did believe these things, and that, like, C.S. Lewis made a great argument in the point of like why to believe in the divinity of Jesus, and he points to the Jewish faith as like his belief. And so basically, because of what Jesus described and what he believed, that's where I kind of find faith in like the Old Testament in a sense, but not in the sense of like it's literal, because there's so much oral tradition and interpretation that went down that line. But once we get to more current history with Jesus, that's where it gets a little more accurate. And that's kind of where I find belief in, because of those historical context, and because of the fact that I can look at it and find pretty decent rationality within Christ and like what he was ascribing to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I've seen debates on whether or not Jesus was a real person or not, and honestly, I don't know where I fall on that. I think both sides have pretty good arguments, and I just don't think it matters if Jesus was a real person, because there were other people at the same time claiming to be the Messiah. There were other people who claimed to rise from the dead. I mean, supposedly when Jesus rose from the dead, according to the Bible, like thousands of other people rose from the dead. So it wasn't that they're not all God.
Right.
So there's a lot of fanciful, unnecessary stuff. And based on everything else that you believe, like, you seem to understand the tradition of how the faith came to be into the position that it's in. That's what I'm picking up from you. But what I don't understand is why you adhere to it. Why do you adhere to it other than, like, where did it come from? I know the history of Christianity, but I just can't find what do you think it does for you? It's just like community is something you can get from a Star Wars book club. Or being able to identify good from bad is just something that humans do anyway. So you could do that anyway. So investing your life into a Star Wars book club in which you see Luke Skywalker's the good guy, obviously, and Palpatine's the bad guy, obviously, really doesn't mean anything. So do you feel like you'd be, like, losing some sort of spiritual part of human nature to give this up?
Well, we're talking about how, like, the doctrine of Jesus was very it was very complicated and also very, like, relevant to even what I believe today to be very philosophically sound, where he was talking about how God was forgiving people and there was a sacrifice being made through him as a perfect being, as God, as human. And that whole thing is, like, it is complicated, but I mean, I've grown up believing it. And when I started to look more into it and read more into the theology, I kind of just agreed with the sense that, if we commit these sins, if the world is broken, then there is a sacrifice that was made through Jesus, and he was forgiving people through that, and that kind of through him you can find that forgiveness. And for me, like, it's like a reassurance of, like, the fact that if this is true, and which I believe to be true, and I'm ascribing to be true, that means that for myself there is, like, there is a pathway of reconciliation with my misdeeds. And that's kind of where I find the philosophy to be true, and that's kind of what Jesus proposed. That's what I get out of it, right?
Okay.
That's what
I mean, I can understand that mentality a lot better than some of the other things you were saying. So
that's also in tangent with those things. Is what I'm saying, because I think a lot of people will say, like, religion has no place in society, and if you don't have religion, then it's no different. But I don't agree with that. And with the religious beliefs I hold, that's not something I'm trying to force on people necessarily, and throw, like, say, yeah, you have to believe this, you're going to hell. So that's why I kind of try and explain and elaborate on those points.
I still understand you. I think that Christopher Hitchens made this point better than I can, and he said something about how it doesn't, like, everything you just said essentially implies that you can be responsible for some evil and then you can pawn it off onto somebody else. Even if they're God, it doesn't matter. Like, for some reason, you're not responsible for making your situation right. God is responsible for making your situation right. And the vicarious redemption is messed up. That's not a healthy idea to have floating around in your head as a good idea. And I don't know where you would take that, but so essentially, to me, in order to make my misdeeds or my sins or whatever you want to call them, it doesn't matter. To make my misdeeds right, like if I hurt my girlfriend's feelings or something like that, then I need to make it up to her, and that's how you do things. Like, so the very idea that I could pray or somebody else could ever intervene and take my responsibility away from me is not healthy.
Well, I think you're confusing the terms of responsibility and also, like, punishment alongside, because what biblical tradition kind of teaches is that when sin is when someone sins or does a misdeed or does something that's wrong in the eyes of God, and they do these bad things, the consequences aren't taken away on a level of, like, what you've done. And so even though the Bible says, like, yes, you can come to Jesus and be forgiven for theft and murder has way more consequences, and God's not going to swoop down and take you out of prison.
Like, how do you determine what's wrong to God?
See, that's actually a really simple question, because when you're talking about morality on a human level, it's very, like, vertical. It's like, okay, down here is theft and up here is, like, genocide. But when you're talking about a creator and what the Bible believes to be God, it's very lateral, where it's like, if you have done anything against what God has explicitly said and determined, then now you have reached a point where you are committing like what's called cosmic treason to some, like what some pastors have described, where God's laid down a foundation, a groundwork, and you've basically spit in the eye and spit in his eye and like chosen to go a different way. That's kind of like the whole interpretation of Adam and Eve. Even though it's just an apple, they disobeyed God, which is like beyond understandable. And
so,
yeah, go for it.
So God thinks that there's something wrong with the fact that Kyle is gay, and from my understanding, you do not. Who's right, you or God?
Well, you're talking about literal interpretation. Yeah, Kyle's right. Yeah. Kyle's husband / boyfriend, whoever is right. No, so
I have one of those.
Yeah, so
no one told me.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're talking about is like, for example, like for someone like for homosexuality. The hard part for me to like find groundwork in is what is cultural and what is determined by like a deity, or what by religious code and doctrine.
Could it all be cultural?
Could it all be cultural? Maybe. That's something I'm open to like think about and mull through. But here's the thing, even on a philosophical level, if you're thinking like God is good and he is just, he would not judge people accordingly to like random transgressions and then throw them in a pit of fire. Like that is beyond that doesn't make any sense. And the idea that
didn't he design everything?
Right. Well, and the idea that he designed the world, he designed the universe, he designed me, and that I'm going to sin and that now I'm going to hell forever doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So that mentality either has to have a way of forgiveness or it has to have, like, it's completely destroyed at that point because it doesn't make any sense logically. And the idea that Jesus came back and died for our sins so that we can be forgiven is something that provides that escapism, almost like not escapism, but like forgiveness and avoiding that punishment. And so for someone like, and this is where I'm a little iffy on like taking a stance on, I've seen like a lot of progressive contemporary Christians that have said like, okay, it's all cultural, and even like the literal resurrection could be like cultural as well. It could be wrong. But the idea that God exists is something that I still ascribe to, and that he would forgive me if I'd come to him and ask for that forgiveness, which is in the Christian theology, is like I hold on to. And I've seen a lot of progressive Christians that believe that, and that's something I'm interested in. And their idea of like, well, then what is sin is like, well, it's a morality that's embedded in all of us, like live a good life. And that's something that it's just it's hard. It's hard to find that found work.
I don't really feel like you answered the question though. So Kyle's in the right and God's in the wrong?
You're still going on literal interpretation at that point, which I'm saying.
But that's the only way. There has to be some sort of literal interpretation in order to say that Yahweh makes some rules. So is this one of the rules that Yahweh didn't really make?
I mean, at that point, it's just like, that's either up to the individual to look at and make interpretation, or for me, at least, what I look at is that and this is where I do admit some like logical fallacies at play that I still am working through. Like I had this conversation like a week ago with one of my youth leaders where I was like, listen, I don't get how, if we're going to say stoning people is cultural and wrong now, that homosexuality is still not okay. Because then you're selectively choosing what morals we ascribe to are carrying over.
I still feel like you're doing that, just not in such an extreme way.
What I'm not doing is giving that any credibility. What I'm saying is like, I believe that Jesus was real, but the idea that anything else that comes alongside that, there's some questioning. And even with Jesus, like you said, there are some arguments that he did or did not exist. And so I'm still trying to work through that. But the sense of like, I've grown up in that community and I'm still trying to ask those questions is something that I'm being cognizant of. And so if we're saying like, is Kyle right? I mean, again, there's arguments mainly in defense of Kyle and the idea that is cultural. And that brings in questions of what else is cultural. And that's kind of where I'm finding some loose footing.
So do you think?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. So God, tell me if I'm mischaracterizing you. So you believe that God is some sort of close to perfect, if not perfect, being of goodness who will give you forgiveness if you truly want it. And that's such an important part of your theology that it would have to be shaken in a very core way to even really let go of that. So can you imagine for just 1 second if you were God of a universe? Like, let's say we had the technology where you could simulate a universe and you could determine what the creatures in that universe were going to be like.
Okay.
Could you fathom considering yourself good and perfect if you had a problem with the way you made things?
Well, that's if the creation is like according to what you made.
Right, well, it doesn't. Yeah. So isn't the creation the way God made it in your theology?
Well, no, because a lot. I'm not sure if all Christian beliefs like ascribe to this, but it's the idea of like a fallen and imperfect world where after sin was introduced.
But he made it that way. He made things that were set up to inherently go that way. He knew that was what was going to happen beforehand, according to the theology.
Well, then what you're kind of proposing is that because God created the world, and say for instance Adam and Eve, which I still am under the idea that it may be metaphorical, that the apple is there and they chose to eat it, and that introduced sin, and that is God's fault because he placed that apple there, or he made the people that chose that. I'm not sure at that point.
I'm not trying to question God. I'm trying to question more like you. In the hypothetical where you're playing God, can't you imagine doing a much better job?
I mean, not really, because what you're running into an issue of like, when do you allow free will, and does that allow sin to persist and bad deeds to persist? And if that happens, then what realm do you govern over?
He didn't really give us free will. So first of all, free will is not a debate in itself, I don't think. I think it's pretty settled that libertarian free will doesn't exist. But anyway, if we just kind of move past that,
not open that can of worms.
Yeah, that's a totally different than religious conversation. To try to understand where you're coming from, you have I think I could create a universe better. Like, I think I could give people free will. Just like, here's you could choose from any of these options. Here's a giant pool of options, more options than we currently have at our disposal. Create physics so everybody can pick what they want in their life. But just don't make some of those options like rape. If people just weren't created in a way where rape was ever a consideration whatsoever, then that wouldn't be part of free will, because nobody would choose for it. Like, we neurologically don't control our impulses. And so if you're going to ascribe your nature or your personality to what God gives you, and you have some sort of soul, and he has this plan for all of these things, and he'll communicate with you, then he does have all of this set up in exactly the way he thinks it's going to go. Well, I could do the same thing, create the same world where just like no one would consider vaccines problematic. It's just not something that they would consider. Then what? Then the world would be the same as it is now, but just better, and it still has free will. So why would God give us such shit options?
Well, you're talking about how like God is presenting the option of like, you can either like do exactly what I say, or you can go and like rape and murder, which are very like large extremes. And what like the Christian theology, at least from what I understand, proposes is that when mankind first decided to introduce sin into creation, or be sinful, and I've seen a lot of different ways that people interpret that, but the idea that when sin enters the world and people are able to do bad things, God is now allowing that to happen because he presented the choice of like, either you follow me or you do this, which I think almost like prescribes onto a personal level, where I can choose to like be good and moral, or I can choose to do bad things. Because I don't think you'd argue that if someone like went out and raped someone, it'd be because of their neurological functions. It's because they're a garbage human being. And
I disagree with that. No, I would actually say that it is because of their neurological functions, and a better understanding of how neurology works essentially would make that person seem like a victim of their brain's activity and not like a decider. That's the case
for when you're talking about disorders like psychopathy and neurological dysfunctions, when I definitely would argue that there are times where innate evil is or personal decisions are at play there. Because if we're talking, go ahead.
Okay, so I watch the Atheist Experience sometimes, and a point that really resonates with me on this issue is Tracy Harris. One time, she pointed out that if there was a little girl one room away, God is everywhere, right? He's always able to control things and talk to you and to make prayers happen or whatever. If there was a girl one room away and she was getting raped, and Tracy could stop it, or if I could stop it, we would do something to stop it. But if God knew there was a little girl getting raped one room away, he would just let it happen because it's worth it in the long run. That's fucked up.
Wait, well, hello. I don't know who's coming through. Isaac, it's me and Ryan are talking.
With Ryan?
Yeah, this is Isaac. Isaac and Ryan are now going to face off and start fighting.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
2-on-1.
Yeah.
We're going to get you.
Bring it
on.
on.
Get out of here. Yeah, so what you're kind of proposing is that if God has the power, he has responsibility to intervene, and also that.
And that he set up the circumstances in which the person's being raped to begin with, because he created the rapist and the neurological pathways for them to take and the circumstances in which that would happen. He's responsible on every level, and he doesn't do anything about it.
Well,
and you think that that's someone worth praying to?
At that point, what you're kind of just go ahead.
Ryan, try to let Ethan get his complete thought out, because I don't know if it's the lag or something like that, but you kind of cutting me in and cutting off the tail end of it, and I'm not able to hear what he's saying. There is a little bit of a delay between, just because of vMix, so just be mindful of that, and let each other finish the entire thought. You're doing great so far. Just keep that in mind.
Okay.
Okay.
So if you want to continue that thought, you can go ahead. Or
well, essentially the idea is that I'm trying to propose to you a hypothetical scenario in which you can imagine making a better universe than God, just with similar parameters. You don't even have to say that it's, that it's possible or whatever, but just in an imaginary world where all the things that you want to keep, like your idea of free will, or at least whatever you're calling free will, this individuality, essentially. Mm-hmm. All the things that are important to you, forgiveness for your misdeeds, all of those things can happen. But you don't need this like kind of capricious entity at the base of all of it, who's like very fickle about what he thinks is wrong and when he thinks it's wrong and how he communicates that, and all like, it just doesn't seem like this is as logical as you're putting it out to be, and it's not as consistent with the other things that you think. So I feel like you can, in my head, I don't want to speak for you, but in my head, I feel like you can imagine a better universe than God created, and you don't want to.
Okay. Well, so here's what I would challenge. If you were like, say, okay, so let's turn this back on kind of your perspective of like, if I was in the position of God and I had someone in the other room who was suffering and was, in your case, being raped. At what level is that suffering allowed? Is it when they stub their toe? Is it when they cut themselves? Is it when they are assaulted? And is it when they're raped? Like, the level of evil and sin at play that has to be intervened at, depending on what you're encountering, I feel like could change very easily. And then you're deciding what I would almost argue would be like a dystopia of being completely controlled, because then at that point, God's intervening on every single level, and there is no individual choice at play of what's going to happen, which I think comes back to like our argument of like, these actions are either due to neurology or actions and personal choice. But again, like, what level of suffering is allowed, and is it no suffering at all? And at that point, then, if someone chooses to disobey God, then you're saying, no, you have to obey me. You have to ascribe to these rules, because that almost seems like a very apathetic way that a God would function, where it's like, you have to obey this.
Okay. Wouldn't God be better if he intervened when people were being harmed by other people, at least?
I mean, then it comes back again to like, what are you allowing? Like, what's the parameter of like what's okay?
People to hurt themselves.
Very broad.
Yeah. If the only thing God allowed people to harm was themselves, wouldn't that be better just in every way?
Potentially. I mean, you're talking about how it's for me. We're talking about how you're intervening into actions that want to be carried out, and that for a God who is in complete control to ascribe that kind of power to people to choose what they would like to do and how they would like to form the world, I can see the argument that that's almost apathetic to give us that ability, but like I don't see it that way necessarily, because those kind of limitations they do again seem very dystopian, since like you cannot do anything that you desire, and there's still punishment involved, right? Like, I'm not saying that God is allowing these things to happen without punishment. The idea that when you rape, murder, steal, and kill, there's still punishment.
Right, but that's the point of that's what I meant by Tracy Harris's point, was that the whole point that God is going to let this happen because he knows it's happening, and then he's going to punish this person later rather than preventing it from happening at all, is why Tracy is superior to your version of God as a human, as like a good person. So Tracy Harris of the atheist experience is superior morally to the thing that you think is worth praying to and asking for forgiveness for. So why don't you just pray to Tracy? She's nicer.
I mean, I totally get what you're trying to propose, but it again comes back to the fact that like what you and Tracy are saying is that given the ability, given the power, given the responsibility, I would do this differently in a way that did not allow these events to take place. And I would intervene. And what the Christian theology and what God is doing is a sense of like, okay, I am presenting this world to you. You have the option to do bad things if you desire. We said we want to do bad things. Said, okay, now the ball's in your court. Like, this is your fault now. And like, at this point, like it's like, I guess the way I'm trying to present it is that for a God who is empathetic, we have to be given the choice to disobey or obey. And what's being presented is that if every choice I make is circumvented, I don't have a choice. And if every choice I make is like controlled, then there really is no free will in that regard. And making those parameters like, well, it goes here and here and here seems very subjective and also like a little bit, I don't want to say arrogant, but it's like I could do better. And I could decide better when it's a very complicated issue. And you're talking about putting parameters on actions and putting control on people. If that makes sense.
You lost me a little bit there towards the end, but I think I follow what you're saying. Let me ask you a different question because I feel like we're just going to circle around on free will on this 1,000 times.
Go for it.
So, do you feel like as an atheist, I'm missing anything? Like, there's anything in life that I should be in any bit concerned about?
Cinnamon Toast Crunch.
I mean, yeah. There you go. I mean, like, I could say maybe I'm talking about like a sense of forgiveness, a sense of like security. But a lot of people get that out of themselves, anyways. And for me, it's the matter of like I find my security in my faith and my personality, like a lot of who I am out of my faith. And I wouldn't say that you have to do that. So part of me says no, and that's because I'm just very open with a sense of my faith and trying to say it is my faith and not yours. So I'm a little weary to say like you are missing like a ton of like you can't be happy. Like,
am I missing anything? Is there some part of life that you think that is important or natural or like for example, I think if people never take any psychedelics, then they miss out on something that's very important to human nature in life. So I wouldn't say that people who have never taken psychedelics are all missing out because some people shouldn't, and I wouldn't say that everyone should take them whenever. Mm-hmm. But I do think that it's like you don't know until you know kind of thing. And so I'm asking you, do you feel like there's anything that do you feel like there's some sort of spirituality that I can't get that you can get? Do you feel like if you gave up your Christianity and you ended up closer to my position, what would you actually be giving up?
Well, like you just said with like the psychedelic thing, you're talking about some people don't or can't, and some people should, and they would be missing out. And so, I mean, for you could be one of those people in my eyes that, yeah, like you won't be missing out on much. And for my eyes, it's like if you're not seeking forgiveness for your actions, you're thinking I can just atone for it myself, then maybe there's a little bit of like something being missed there on a philosophical level. But on a personal level of like what you're getting out of life, your enjoyment, your spirituality, maybe not. Because that's you, but for me, I might be detrimentally affected if I lost my faith. And so that's just something that I feel like if you're going to say, oh, no one should be at all religious or spiritual, that's kind of overlooking the fact that someone like myself or someone like, my neighbor could be completely devastated or not living a fulfilled life without those beliefs in play. Because you could function on a very different level.
So the thing that, would it be fair to say that you would say if you would lose anything, it would be a more objective feeling of forgiveness?
Yeah, objective, not subjective, but objective. Yeah, like that's a real thing. Yeah, I would.
Okay. Have you? I mean, I know that you as a person have made up for things that you feel like you did wrong in your life.
Okay.
Right. So, did that feel insufficient to you? Like have you ever like made somebody pissed off and then made it up to them, and then you guys are friends again, and you're chill, and is there something else looming over your head once you make it up to them?
Well, so when we're talking about like what things I've done wrong that I've asked forgiveness for and I've like worked out on my own, the responsibility I've taken, I haven't felt guilt for, but there's a sense of like I have done a misdeed, and especially if it's not forgiven, like am I just screwed at that point if my friend chooses not to forgive me? Do I just move on and like let that sit and simmer and just like have that weight or have that guilt completely
very tough part
negligent?
Of life.
So that's something for me that I've experienced that I've like found solace in of like, okay, well, even if this person doesn't forgive me, and even if they don't understand that I truly am sorry or I have tried my best to make up for this mistake, and I am paying for the responsibilities of what I've done, at least on a spiritual level, God understands. He knows that what I've done is wrong and I'm going to suffer for that. He's not going to come in and swoop and save the day, but he does forgive me. And so that's something that I find, comfort in, if that makes sense. If that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Essentially, I think that I experience the same thing that you're talking about by just really forgiving myself. I feel like what you're talking about is like having a good enough, in quotes, good enough, even though Steve hates in quotes, good enough reasons to forgive yourself. And if somebody else doesn't forgive you, that might seem like, well, then I don't have good enough reasons. But like I've done things to people that I shouldn't have done, and we're not friends, but we're nowhere close to the friends that we were at the time in which we were, and that really sucks. Like that's what I get for being a teenager and thinking like that sometimes. But that's what happens, and so I have to forgive myself. I learned I'm not like that anymore. I understand myself better and why I chose the choices that I made when I was younger. That doesn't mean that I am like wretched or that my life has fallen, or I don't need to frame things in a way where everything is falling apart. That is essentially the same thing you believe in, but without supernature.
But you're talking about how like consistently mistakes are made and you're having to forgive yourself and take on punishments, take on consequences.
Well, that's what I think you're calling God.
Well,
I think we're describing the same experience, but you're calling it God.
But so the thing that's different though is a sense of like on a Christian theology that everyone is innately, doing bad, and there is no way you can truly find forgiveness outside of like suffering for it. And if we don't suffer for it, if we don't take the consequences, then we're really getting out lucky. If I kill someone, get away with it, and I'm fine with it, like I deserve so much punishment, or I deserve I deserve the consequences I avoided, right? And that's something that on a cosmic level we avoid every day. It's kind of like the idea of a Christian theology, and that separating ourselves from God and choosing to choosing to disobey Him is something that still, for the same reasons, requires that consequence. And so, from what I'm understanding, what I believe is that like my actions, my disobedience, my poor choices, there's something that I cannot forgive myself because I don't have like the power to, I don't have the ability to, and I don't have the right to, really. Like what good is it if I'm, as the Bible describes, like a dirty rag who just continues to do bad things over and over again, if I forgive myself? That doesn't really give me any solace, doesn't really give me any room to continue on what I'm doing without like radically changing who I am, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
like,
but
what right do I really have?
So the difference between what you and I are saying is you think that the Bible accurately describes how wretched and lame and pathetic people are, and I think that people have certain natures that are lame, and the vast majority of people are annoying and stupid the vast majority of time. But honestly, that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to forgive themselves. There's no evidence ultimately of God. There's no reason to think that the Bible accurately describes human nature. Ultimately, everything comes down, I said ultimately a lot just then.
Yeah.
But ultimately, everything is coming down to you believe in free will, and you believe that the people who are exercising free will are inherently doomed in the way that they use it, and that there needs to be some cosmic kind of like error corrector for this. There's no reason. You don't need any of that. You could literally just accept that humans do shitty things. You can accept that humans are the ones that make things right. So everything that's wrong with the world on a human level, that's us. That's our fault. And we need to make that better. But everything that's going right with the world, Elon Musk trying to get to Mars has nothing to do with God. And anybody who's trying to solve the water crisis in Flint, Michigan still, not, I mean, these are real things that real people do. It's really good. And if they didn't do a good enough job, or if they feel like it's just, I can't empathize with one sentence you said, which is that you can't forgive yourself. You don't, like, where's the right that a person has to forgive themselves? Like, you're you. Who else is going to forgive you? Who else is going to give you that? Like, even when you think God is forgiving you, that's still you accepting that you think God forgave you. So it's like on your own authority, you've decided God forgives you.
But you're running under the mindset that like it's just me saying like, oh, I believe this because I believe it, and I'm going to believe that I forgive myself because God forgave me, which is very circular logic of like, oh, because I believe this is true, which, from my perspective is that it genuinely is. And if that was a hypothetical that you would entertain, I feel like it'd make a little more sense. And you're also going saying,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So you're also kind of going under the premise that like you can't do good things without God, and that it doesn't make any sense because people do good things without God all the time, like Elon Musk and people in Flint, Michigan. And being good and doing good things are different. Like if I am a innately bad person, I make bad decisions or selfish decisions, or I have a drive or a motivation to look out for myself beyond anyone else, or be hateful or spiteful, like within myself towards someone else. That doesn't mean I can't do good things outwardly, and that's where I kind of find difference in your logic, where it's like people are innately self-centered, very hateful and spiteful people on an individual level, like very deep down, and those are outwardly expressed different ways. And those are outwardly expressed maybe sometimes, completely opposite of their intentions. I've experienced that 100,000 times in school where I can't stand someone's guts, and I'm like, "What's up, dude?" And I literally I can't stand them. And what Jesus described was that like when you're looking at someone with that kind of level of contentment, you are murdering them on a same level, because you're in your heart, you're murdering them in what your belief is and what you're looking at them, and the way that you're behaving internally just isn't being externalized, and that's not any better. And that's kind of where I find some reasoning.
I don't think I can grant you that, because to say that murdering someone in your mind is not any better than murdering someone in real life is not. I mean, maybe that's mischaracterizing what you just said, but I think that's kind of silly.
What I'm saying is like there obviously are different consequences to that. Like there's literally no consequences of thinking about someone negatively. But when you have like an innate sense of like hatefulness, contentment, spite, that will express itself in a way that eventually bubbles. And the root of a problem isn't the actions, it's the heart that's leading to it. And that's something that cannot be changed by correction. That's something that is innate. And that's something that the Bible teaches, that like the heart is deceitful and it's like it's evil above everything else. It's not your actions aren't just coming out of nowhere.
Okay. So Sam Harris gives an example of the clock tower shooter who felt that he had a tumor right before he did all of the shootings, before he assassinated people. And he wrote a letter that said that they should investigate his brain when all of that was said and done. And when they did, they found a tumor exactly where you would expect to find a tumor. I think it was on his amygdala, and that caused him, very likely caused his behavior. He wasn't like that before the tumor, and then he got killed. But so let's say that hypothetically he didn't get killed, and you remove the tumor, and he never acts like that again.
Right.
So did he do anything wrong?
Wait,
and should he ask God for forgiveness? Is what I'm asking.
Right. So physically he did. I mean, physically he murdered people. That's not cool. And he did it for reasons that we can ascribe and understand. And,
like medically, yeah.
Medically, right. So so that's something that I find interesting, that a lot of like biblical and religious reasonings were medical. And I can understand that to an extent. But we're talking about people that are perfectly healthy, have perfectly stable mindsets, that still behave in similar patterns, that still behave in selfish and contentful and very, I wouldn't say evil, but like, in ways that are immoral. And that's something that I kind of find interesting, is that when the Bible's talking about like, okay, your heart is where your actions stem from, and that's the problem. It isn't your actions explicitly; it's where it's leading from that needs to be changed. Because you could put someone through a correction facility and change the way they act and do things, but their motivations are still the same. And that's something that the Bible is saying, like, that's the problem. And I think that that's across the board and not just like a medical thing.
Wouldn't the tumor example undermine that? Because Sam Harris's version of that, the reason he gives that is, if we could find out what happened in people's lives, if we could find all the tumors that were causing all the things people were doing, right, then we wouldn't blame the people, we would blame the things. But the things, we don't have that ability to access that information all the time.
Well, so what factors are under personal responsibility, and what are like medical things you can change? Like if my parents are arguing and I'm getting really stressed out, does that give me the right to go out and kill someone because that's the tumor that's in place in my life?
No. Right. So I think that on a secular level, the answer to that question is you just can't hurt other people.
But you're saying that, like, so the tumor example is something that you cannot control, right? That's something that is still that's in you that you cannot change. So therefore, the actions are displaced from your responsibility. But what at that point is okay? Like, what at that point is like
is
written off, and what is? Yeah, go ahead.
So we can categorize responsibility into two different categories. There's the responsibility that people are physically accountable for. So like the guy the clock tower shooter actually shot those people, and he's the one who's physically accountable. That's how the events happened. But his consciousness didn't make that decision. His intentions didn't make that decision. There was nothing leading up in his life that was stressing him out and like it built up to that decision. So none of that happened in that regard. So he's not responsible for punishment. So if responsibility inherently has to do with punishment, then there's no real reason to punish that guy, even if he's still alive, because no part of him has ever, without the tumor, experienced that problem. You're not going to teach him. You're not going to correct any of his behaviors. Nothing's going to get better by punishing him.
Right.
So then there's the responsibility in terms of accountability. He is accountable, and he will have to live with the fact that that's who he is if he was still alive. But he doesn't deserve to be punished, even though he did damage. Because, like, what are we punishing? The tumor that he had?
But what I'm saying is you're going to an extreme level, and on a very casual basis, people are going to have what you even said yourself are the factors that lead to their behavior that cause them to do bad things. And that you would blame those factors instead of the person. But at what level of like influence is it the person's physical responsibility to deny that and act in a way that is moral? Because even on a secular level, you have responsibility for how you act on a moral level. And so at that point, if I choose to engage with like the negative influences and negative events in my life, or the things that are causing me to want to act in a certain way, or even without my conscious choice, like what is that? That just seems like a very broad spectrum that's using extreme as an example.
So are you asking me?
Yeah. Like I'm asking kind of like at what point is like that displacement of responsibility given to that person? Like, is it only when it's medical? Is it when, they have too much going on, they have a physical change or a physiological change?
I think that every person should feel responsible for themselves. So if you are the person in question, then you are the one who has to be working the hardest to make you better. To try to, like, if you're not doing that, then you're responsible because you're not doing everything you can to be as good as you can be, which is where the personal individual responsibility comes in. But it's then responsible for everyone else to take the time to actually understand the factors at play. And if I realize that one of the things that is affecting one of my roommates is the kinds of environments that they come home from work to or something, I can change that and change their life, even though that's not really going to change. It's just one factor, for example, but it will make them not stressed on a certain level. And they're still responsible for their own choices, but I'm responsible for understanding that those choices are not just like on the fly, I've decided to be good or I've decided to be bad. It's an accumulation of things, and I influence that accumulation of things. So part of other people being good is me setting them up to be. And part of them being good is them relentlessly making themselves better than they used to be. So the responsibility falls on yourself.
So at that point, if they can't change what they're relentlessly pursuing and you're not able to influence it, then it's out of your control.
Yeah, and then you need therapy or medical assistance or whatever to find the reason.
I think that makes sense, but I'm skeptical of the sense that like when you remove those factors or you pursue that person, that they would still be capable of behaving selfishly or behaving in a way that is negative or moving on to just another factor at play, because the world is so chaotic and we have so many things that try and divide our attention and pull us in ways that are negative, that you'd constantly be changing the scenario for someone when oftentimes too, when they're outside of that, they still behave selfishly. That's where I kind of find a little bit of skepticism in, is that if I remove every single stress in your life, you'd still look out for yourself above anyone else, and you still behave in a way that would potentially be negative. I'm not saying you specifically, but people in general. And that's something to where I find I'm just skeptical of, because there's still a level of personal accountability on a level outside of your factors at play that are influencing your behavior that you will still have to manage. and that if I want to be selfish, I have to choose not to be. But I can only do that for so long because I innately am selfish. I innately am, contemptuous. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I do think though that that's a misunderstanding, not on your end, but just on like general people's experience. There's no reason to think that because people are selfish that is inherently motivating their action. So for example, I want to play the music that I make at certain venues in the future. That's a goal of mine. And part of that goal is that there's a few really close friends of mine that I want not just to participate in that process, but to feel the exhilaration of accomplishing that goal. So part of the goal is to bring other people along with me. And that's every goal I've accomplished so far. Seems like my happiness is driven by giving other people that I actually care about happiness. So as selfish as it is for me to pursue my goals, part of my selfishness is sort of being altruistic and wanting to bring everyone up with me. I am being selfish in that I want to bring myself up, and I think I deserve better than wherever I am constantly. But I don't think that selfishness is in itself a problem. It depends on how you play it out.
Right. Well, I think what you're talking about a very altruistic, like you said, very like I guess wholesome almost like level of selfishness where it's like I want to do things that are best for me, but I also want to take other people and help them as well. Like that's not necessarily the selfishness that I'm speaking towards. I was like, okay. Yes, I have my goals. Because if you were completely externally focused, you'd fall apart. Like you can't focus on literally everyone else and not look out for yourself in some regard.
Right.
Like if I chose to feed everyone else before me, I'd starve. Like that, and then at that point, I'm not doing anything. And what I'm saying is that like when you're talking about other people that may not be as cognizant of that may not have taken strides to stop that, or maybe people that have that are just not able to. Innately, those people all have to struggle with the same exact thing, which is they are selfish. They are choosing to look out for themselves in a way that may be negative, and also that they can be hateful. They can be violent sometimes. Like those are urges at play that is across the board on almost every culture that is independent of factors like your home life, how you were raised, and like your culture and your biological makeup, because almost every single person across the globe is going to have some innate drive to do some of these things, to be either violent or selfish in a way that's negative and act immorally. And that's something that cannot be necessarily gotten rid of. You can't change that completely. And so you're talking about like, okay, I'm selfish in a way that's good, but like that's just you. That's something that you're making strides towards, which probably was hard, to do that. And that's because right, go ahead.
I feel that it works for everyone. It's just more like if you like some of the things that probably make you happiest is other people who have gotten vaccinated because of you. Right. And the strength that you've given other people. Do you find a sort of selfishness and disgustingness to that happiness? Do you think that there's something wrong with that? Or do you think that maybe people just don't see the pattern in their lives? That generally they do feel happy a lot more than they give themselves credit for. They just don't recognize that when they're most happy is when they're making other people most happy.
I mean, like, I totally am blown away when I'm able to do something good and fulfilling, and like, that it's helping other people. But that's not where I get my fulfillment from. And so I try and displace that and go like, hey, like, if you like made a decision through like what I've done, that's great. You can do this as well. It's not all me. And I try and be like, have a sense of humility with that, and I go, yes, I am happy because you did something because of me. Like that's not what I try and do. And I mean, like, I totally agree that some people might not be like giving themselves enough credit for what they've done, and that there's a lot of health and benefits and a lot of security that can be found by like giving yourself more credit. But I think that it is ignorant to ignore that people innately have a drive to be negative. And I think even Nietzsche talked about how like those drives, those motivations, you can ignore them, you can change them, you can choose to like act in a way that isn't according to those drives. That's just like the struggle of being a moral person, is that you can easily fall into evil. It's harder to be good than it is to be a bad person. That's something I don't think you'd argue on.
No, I'm not trying to ignore it. I think that everything evil that people do is because of evolution, right? So we can fight and we can rape and everything that we can do is literally because a long time ago, the ability to do it, not necessarily cultures of people doing it, but just the ability to do it was beneficial for survival. So we don't have to explain it. We don't have to explain it like there's something wrong with us. That's the creature we are, and we're trying to take the creature that we are and go there. But the whole point of all this is essentially the religion aspect of it. So you're essentially saying that there's this wretched nature of humans, and I'm saying that the thing that you're having a problem with, it can be explained with evolution, was what I just said. But also, it's not inherently a problem, because that is what good people use to be good. And Jordan Peterson, which I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the things that he has to say all the time on religion, I would say that he kind of supports that idea too. He has the same sort of, I don't know how he would word it. I don't want to do a Jordan Peterson, but
yeah. Just get your voice all high and then start going on tangents, and it'll be fine.
Yeah, a little Kermity. I don't have the religion isn't making people bad, and religion isn't making people good. Religion is trying to explain what's there anyway by saying that there's something else there as well.
So do you not think that there's any gain that can be made if you try and look at any scientific evidence and try and look at reasons and logic outside of it and admit some fault and recognize some issues, but still find some subjective value in it if you decide so? Like, do you think that that's ignorant?
I mean, yeah, I would say it's ignorant on some. It depends on what you want. If what you want is that personal feeling of security and everything, then that's going to come at the cost of really knowing what's true, or really being able to ask yourself questions on the level necessary to figure out what's true.
Okay, I mean, I would just kind of disagree a little bit in the sense that, like, if someone's approaching conflict and other ideas openly and adjusting their beliefs accordingly, and trying to be the most, like you even said, like pursuing, what's best relentlessly. If someone's doing that with their logic, but first ascribing to religion, doesn't make them ignorant, And if they don't choose to prescribe to your idea, then I feel like it's almost like a little bit arrogant to say, like, yes, now you are wrong, now you are completely ignorant because you chose not to believe what I believe. Because even like you said, there are some things that you can see both sides, and even if someone decides like they believe in their religion because of their upbringing and they choose to engage that community because it's just easier, I don't think that that's necessarily like, super wrong. Like that's
okay. Yeah, I don't mean to take any of that away from you. I think so. Like, for example, let's say the Jesus debate thing. If we just totally grant you that and say that there is no debate whatsoever, that is necessary for reaching the conclusion that it's intelligent to believe in some religious, especially the Jesus religious points. But it's not sufficient for getting there conclusively or for treating the world like that's how it is, because there are other explanations, and it seems like natural explanations are always the better explanation. So even if we agree on the fact temporarily that Jesus was real, a real person, that doesn't really get us to where you want us to get us. So it's not that I think that you shouldn't take any of these things into account. It's that no matter how many things you take into account, you never get back to Christianity is true. It's just, here's something that I think is kind of indicating that it could be, or here's something that I think is indicating that it could be. But if you really want to know what's true, you're not going to look for indicators that are consistent with your belief. You're going to look for what does everything indicate all at the same time.
Right, but wouldn't that point that I feel like that doesn't line up with what kind of I've been explaining, where it's like I'm not looking for indications that align with myself. Like some of what I've been saying, people will be like, "Oh my God,
no, Ethan's I mean coincidental." I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. You're good. It's like Ethan's not a real Christian. He doesn't believe that Noah actually like put animals on an ark. Like that's kind of how some people function, and I am completely cognizant of that and aware, and I think that it is a level of like I'm still engaging with these ideas, and I think that that's totally like logically consistent, and I'm not saying like this is 100,000% completely like you cannot have any argument. Like that's a very fundamentalist, very like authoritative view that I'm not holding. So,
right.
And I think almost like in a sense that you kind of are, where it's like, oh, you will always come back to this, even though there are still some areas I cannot fully engage with and say this is 100,000% without doubt. Where it's like, Jesus might have been real. And if that's the case, then that raises more questions and that raises more ideas and lends itself to at least some degree of credibility. Like, passively, some.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like the only criticism that I'm giving you at this point is the difference between where you're going to end up concluding things if you're trying to figure out what is true, what in the natural world is actually happening, or if you're trying to figure out what could be true.
Right. I get that.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how to debate any further.
Yeah.
Once you're essentially like, you agree that you're more for the forgiveness side of the thing than the truth side of the thing. Like it's more indicated to you than it is evident to everyone. And so if you admit that, then I don't really know what's left to debate. You believe in something that you don't have conviction on. So it's confusing to me because I usually try to reserve that kind of thing for things that I've been convinced of, like through evidence. You're preemptively starting there and then going out to look for how it could be true.
Well, it's more of that's more of a philosophical than evidence based, because you can't have evidence based that you need forgiveness for sins. Like that's way more philosophical. And that's something that I explain that I buy into because of what I've observed and read into and seen. And that's something that you disagree because you've seen different things and engaged and experienced different things. So
I did start out Christian myself too, though. So like my MySpace page when I first made a MySpace said, "I believe in God and I always will."
There you go. That's good.
Well, I'm here right now proving that that's not accurate.
Hey,
so
well, good on you, man, for adjusting accordingly to what you saw. Like, I'm not gonna sit here and say like that you're going to hell or something like that. Like that's a little rough. Also, my phone's about to die. Like I'm getting there. This has been eating my battery like nothing. So did you guys want to do questions? I hate to cut Ryan off, but like I don't want to cut off in the middle of this. You're like, oh man.
No, I agree. I was trying to conclude by saying I don't know what else to debate you on.
Okay.
You've established your position.
Okay. Let me pull those up real quick. Do you have any last minute thoughts that you want to get out there real quick while I pull this page up?
I mean, not really. I think Ryan makes really good arguments. He makes a lot of sense. I'm not sitting here saying like I don't understand it, and it's something that I'm definitely going to be mulling through for a while and talking to people watching this video. I'm not going to just go on my life and being like, yeah, Jesus knows more than Ryan. Like that's a little rough.
So you're an atheist now. Cool.
Yeah, obviously.
Victory.
Okay, let's see here. RJ, the dimension between the exterior lip of the vulva. Not sure. Clinton Smith, let's super chat with no message. Thank you, Tad Phosophy. Oh no, not Peterson.
Oh no,
Noble Athenian. Yeah, you got a lot of oh no's when you mentioned JP.
Oh no.
Noble Athenian says best show on TV. Carry on doing what you're doing, guys. Thank you. Without a crystal ball, it's Katie. She says, Ethan, I adore you, but JP is one of the worst human beings on the planet. Please find a more reasonable Christian.
Wow. All this hate for JP. I just said that his metaphorical thing made sense. Like, jeez.
Flamio says the Bible is classic Middle Eastern sci-fi. And then Sif says, Kyle, get some coffee. I need to. I've had quite the day today. Okay. Anybody in the chat, if you have any like permanent questions now or like permanent questions, go ahead and tag me in it. Otherwise, I'll let Ryan, do you want to say anything to sum up your chat or any last minute?
Sure. I'll say a little bit. I feel that Ethan, you're really smart compared to the average person. And part of being smart is the ability to not tell when you're wrong about things, because you can make really logical cases about those kinds of things. And so one of the things that I would be skeptical of the most is your own bias, because ultimately that's what's going to get in your way. Like a lot of people, what gets in their way is how they were raised or what they started at. But because you're willing to reconsider things, and you're slowly going to have this track record in your mind where all the bullshit you've ever been told, you slowly figure out better than. So if there's ever that one piece of bullshit that you never figured out better than, you have so much confidence in your own opinion and your ability to form your own opinion that you kind of stop doubting yourself some, and you start to kind of give yourself credence that you don't necessarily deserve. And I totally understand what that feels like. I'm not trying to criticize you specifically. This is something I fall into all the time. But that would be what I think would help you the most, is to be skeptical of your own reasoning and the validity of that more than anything else.
Right. And
your IQ gets in your way.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at, and that's something that I've always just struggled with, the idea that like something's true just because it is. Like a lot of the Christian arguments are like, oh, the Bible is like completely consistent because God made it, and it's like that doesn't make any sense. That's not really an argument. And a lot of these arguments are also built around and constructed around the belief system. So like, well, why is homosexuality like a sin? Oh, well, because God wrote it, and also because like blah 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 blah. And these arguments don't make a lot of sense on a moral level. And it's like, as much as I'd like to understand what you're getting at, like I really don't. And so I have to like say, I would never tell someone, oh, what you're doing is wrong, if I can't explain why. And that's where I always try and find some level of like balance. And so like for me, going into ministry and going into like a pastoral role is meant to kind of at least like change that perspective, at least address those things, at least say like, hey, you can come here, you can just totally disagree, we can talk about it. And honestly, like what we're going to talk about isn't sitting here thumping a Bible in front of you and just saying like, believe this or else, that's not what I'm trying to do here. And like what my church does, we sit down and we look at a verse and we go, okay, like what does this mean for your life? This verse talks about like someone who went through a struggle, and if you're divorcing your husband or wife, like here's how you can like understand this better. Like I feel like that's something you could pull out of any regard, even if you didn't believe that. And so that's kind of what I am more pursuing. So I'm not taking these doubts with me and trying to teach people to believe them, if that makes sense. It's more of like hey, if you get this, if you understand this, if you think this makes sense, cool. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to pursue. So I'm trying not to like make you think, why is he going into ministry if he has like these questions? Like a lot of it's very community organized is what I'm trying to do, and not like literally like theologically assaulting people, like if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So
did we ever get to the bottom of if Kyle was right or not?
I don't think I think so. I think we said yeah. I think we said yeah. I think we said yeah. It's fine.
That was a joke. Artisan Tony, it's the last. Artisan Tony said, "Ethan, keep searching and doing what you are doing. You're a smart guy, and don't let atheists give you crap." And as always, fuck you, Tony. Steve, do you have anything?
Yeah, no. I mean, obviously you're very articulate, and your answers, are. I'm not going to use the word scripted, but they're very ingrained in the how to answer things. Now, you did talk a little bit about philosophy, and I kind of perked up, and you're talking about libertarian free will, at least free will. You subscribe to free will, like actual libertarian free will, because that's a very, very small group that subscribes to that, because even science kind of has determined there's no such thing as libertarian free will. Let me give you an example, and you, if you could tell me how you would actually handle this. If you made a choice deciding between A and B, okay, and you made this choice at some point in time, you go back from wherever in the future, and you come back to that very same point in time, all things being equal, called ceteris paribus, all things being equal. A libertarian free will person would say that you have just as much chance to choose the opposite as you would the one you chose, right? So it's random. You have no idea what the person is going to choose. A determinist, either hard or soft determinist, would say, well, actually, you're going to make the same decision every single time based upon the exact same conditions. We know that determinism is kind of the way the universe runs. It is deterministic. So I kind of have to ask, what makes you hold libertarian free will when science doesn't really say that we have it, because we've determined that the brain actually has a conscious thought of something before we even act upon it. We are never free of all extraneous influence. The only reason to have libertarian free will is for some reason, something in the Bible, I guess, that kind of you kind of have to have for it. But other than that, is there any reasons extraneous to your beliefs that you think we have to have libertarian free will?
One of the arguments I've seen for it, which I'm very skeptical of, that was proposed, at least like I talked to my pastor and some people about this, is that like people behave as if they have free will. People behave as if there's like a universal morality, and those are indicators those things exist, or that when I make a decision, I consciously am behaving in a way as if I have free will, and it is something that is part of human nature to behave as if your actions are not deterministic. And I kind of understand that to a degree, but you can't remove yourself from factors and influences in biology and evolution. And so I think that those are those are more like factors that influence rather than determine in my mind. Like a soft determinism is where kind of I fall. Well, you can't ignore them, but like ultimately, to a certain degree, you still have some level of choice, even if it is small in comparison. So that's kind of where I fall. It's not like literally I can disavow all my upbringing factors and everything and make a choice regardless.
You know? Are you saying that when Steve says you could go back and choose B instead of A, that's possible?
No, what I'm saying is like there definitely I definitely agree that there's like the factors that like will determine it every single time if it's the same exact scenario, like circumstance and all that kind of stuff. But I still believe like to a certain degree when it comes to, like a moral choice.
All right, there we go.
Back up.
We should be.
Okay, well, apparently that means that the YouTube gods have had enough. So, great job to both of you. You have oddly, this is odd for us. We usually don't have people walking away with positive things to say about both sides, but you both seem to have won everyone over, so that's always a good sign. Thank you, Ethan and Ryan, for coming on, and we'll have to do this again.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Good talking to you, Ethan, even if you're not there or buffering still.
Steve, anything you want to throw out there before we pull the plug?
Oh, you might want to tell them they're going to be back tonight.
Yeah, Rand Campbell, the former pimp turned Christian turned flat earther, will be talking with yes, wrap your head around that. We'll be
I'm trying.
We'll be talking with Shannon Q, and we will find out why he says that if you live on the coast of the United States, it's probably a good idea that you move, because once you put on the armor of God and the boots of peace, as he thought, these are direct quotes from him, something's coming, and it's not going to be pretty. He is at war. And we're going to find out why tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern.
Awesome.
See you then.
Night.
Oh Lord, who got the crew?